Namaskar and welcome to Sansad Television. I am Vishal Dahiya and you're watching our show Perspective, where we bring you detailed analysis of all key national and international issues. Today we're going to talk about the global economic impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. In fact, this conflict has upended commodity markets from oil to gas and wheat, leading to the prospects of increase in inflationary pressure on countries trying to revive their economic growth after the pandemic. Now, crude oil prices continue to rise and oil companies like Shell and BP are winding up their operations in Russia. Let's not forget that Russia is the world's third largest oil producer and the second most influential member of the OPEC Plus alliance behind Saudi Arabia. Now, sanctions imposed by United States of America and other Western countries on Russia, particularly banning some Russian banks from the SWIFT global financial payment system, is expected to make it more cumbersome for many companies to do any kind of business with Russia. Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman has recently said that central government was seized of the matter and discussions are underway to do a complete assessment of this particular issue. Today, we will discuss and analyze all aspects of the global economic impact of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and of course the Indian angle to that as well. And for more on this, we're joined by a distinguished panel of experts. Let me first introduce them to you, beginning with, we have with us Mr. Dhanendra Kumar, the former Executive Director for India in the World Bank. We're also joined by Mr. Dharmkirti Joshi, Chief Economist with CRISIL Limited, and Mr. Tarun Kapoor, former Secretary, Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas in the Government of India, is also joining us. Welcome, all of you gentlemen, to Sansad TV. Let me begin with you, Mr. Kumar, Mr. Dhanendra Kumar, and let's start by putting things in perspective here. Let's start by not only understanding, the scope of the economic impact which we're talking about, but also various aspects of it. In which areas specifically are we looking at, given the sanctions and given the crisis on the ground there?
Thank you very much, Vishalji. Let me first of all give my greetings to all the viewers on Mahashivratri Day. We are meeting on a very, very auspicious evening, and I hope and pray that the blessings of Lord Shiva are showered on all of us. The question which you have asked is extremely important, hovering around our minds these days, all of us. This is one of the most complex situations, most intricate situation the world has been facing ever since World War II for a number of reasons. Russia has taken it to their heart to teach a lesson to Ukraine for their audacity to join or attempt to join NATO. And on the other hand, the Western powers, they have all combined against this move. And they, without taking any military action directly, they have imposed all the possible economic sanctions against Russia, including the SWIFT, as you just mentioned, and many other things. Now, this is impacting the world economy in a number of ways. Let me begin by saying that today the entire world is interconnected, and most of the supplies, most of the components, ingredients, commodities from one country to another, and therefore disruption of anything anywhere leads to disruption of the entire supply chain. Also, the transportation, for example, oil supply lines, pipelines, gas lines. Europe is dependent on almost 1/4 of its needs on Russia and Ukraine.
Okay.
Ukraine is also a very big producer of wheat and sunflower and many rare earths and important minerals. So all these things make the situation extremely complex for the world economy, which is resulting in increased inflationary pressures and also difficulties in several countries in many ways.
Okay.
And we can cover some of these things later.
Okay, definitely. That's an overview, and we'll come to all these aspects one by one. Let's start with the crude oil. And Mr. Tarun Kapoor, I'd like to bring you in here. All of us know that crude oil is a very important element in the overall global economic scenario for all nations. On the face of this earth. If we are looking at the present scenario and the way we're seeing a hike in the crude oil prices, what's your assessment of its impact on the global economy as a whole and the ways in which it can be mitigated?
So thank you. This is a very important and a very pertinent question. What we have seen in the past also is that the oil price and also gas price, they are very volatile. Gas price is even more volatile than the oil price. A little disturbance anywhere in the world or even a very small happening, reduction in production by say even 1% has a huge impact on the price globally. And we've seen price go beyond $100. There were times during COVID when the price had fallen to say $20, even negative price was there, but then $20 was a reality. We also bought at that price. And at that point of time, we thought that $50 is a reasonable price. Very recently, there was a statement by a minister from Russia. He said $70 is a reasonable price. But $100 is way beyond what one could treat as reasonable price. So, which means that much extra is being paid by the various oil companies, and then if it is passed down to the consumers, then by the consumers. And this is a sector where the demand is not dependent on the price. So even if the price goes up, the demand remains the same. In India also, we've seen that even in high petrol and diesel price, the demand didn't fall. So a country like India, where we are importing 85% of our crude requirements, even after that, we still import 50% of finished product LPG. And we also import some petrol and diesel sometimes when there is a little bit of a problem. So our imports are around $100 billion, or say more than 7 lakh crore rupees worth every year.
Okay.
So a huge impact on the foreign exchange, a huge impact on the economy, a huge impact on the consumers.
Okay. We'll come to the mitigation part as well a bit later in the second round. But let me bring in Mr. Joshi here as well. Mr. Joshi, as is pretty evident, the most important aspect of the sanctions put in place by the Western countries on Russia is putting out various important or rather large Russian banks out of the global payment system SWIFT. Now, the question is, how does it impact the banking and the trade scenario overall? Because this is likely to have a cascading effect on the supply chains as well.
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, to put the overall things in context, I think the global economy is not in great shape. I think we're just coming out of COVID-19, and I think there are other risks also in the horizon in context of which this needs to be looked at. I think, for instance, the US, which is the most systemically important central bank in the world, is going to raise interest rates soon. I think that also has effects on the financial sector. It tightens financial conditions. So I think as far as the restrictions on Russian payment systems are concerned, I don't feel that we are going to be impacted in a great way, because India also has a ruble trade with Russia. So I think this is targeted more at crippling the Russian economy, I think, and whatever spillover effect of that is plays out, I think that will be felt by other countries. Here, I think one must also point out, I think it's oil and natural gas is not the only thing which Russia is good at. I mean, they also have, I think, the very rare minerals, etc. I think palladium, etc., which are used in automobile production. So that I think they can also, that will also have a spillover effect, I think, which is a feedback loop into the rest of the world, I mean, so to say.
Okay.
I think so if you're stopping Russia, I think then they can also stop a few things which will create frictions, I think, in the short run. So I think that's the overall context in which I would look at what's being imposed on Russia right now.
Okay, okay. Mr. Dhanendra, do you agree with what Mr. Joshi is saying, that there's this spillover effect which we're talking about? You were also earlier mentioning how, wheat and other rare minerals, in addition to oil, natural gas, are an important component of this economic situation which we are looking at. But this is going to be a short-term impact for many countries. Do you agree, Mr. Kumar?
Yes, I agree with Mr. Joshi in this regard. The impact, yes, certainly would be there. There are so many things which are others are dependent on the region. For example, lithium for the lithium batteries, titanium, and other rare earths, commodities, sunflower oil. There is a possibility that the prices may go up. Wheat, they are one of the biggest exporters, and because of the sanctions and because of the difficulties in transportation, there could be possibility of for India to supply and get some benefit out of it. But altogether, I agree with him that in the short term, yes, perhaps there may not be too much of a stress on India, but India does have its moments of concern, as that has been pointed out by the finance minister. India is closely studying the situation, and particularly in the field of oil, gas, and other things which are imported from there. Russia is 25th most important, the biggest trading partner of India. Although the total trade is not really too much, but for everything concerned, it would be important.
Okay.
And same is true of the other region also.
Okay.
In this regard.
Okay, okay. Mr. Kapoor, let's look at ways to go ahead and mitigate this impact, as I was, asking you earlier. In terms of specific context of India, when we're talking about, the crisis which might erupt due to rise in crude oil prices, how do we deal with? What's the strategy we have, or what should be done?
Now, there are two aspects to this. One is availability, and the second is the price. So on availability, so far, we've not seen any shortages, and India has been importing, depending on its requirement, importing freely. Though you would remember that when the COVID was at its peak, there were shortages in Europe, but in India, there were no shortages. So we have some good purchase arrangements, so that problem may not arise even now, unless there are some major disruptions from the Middle East also, which is highly unlikely. Now, the second question is about price. So what I see is that natural gas is even a bigger problem compared to crude, because Europe is largely dependent on Russia for natural gas, and natural gas flows are through pipelines. So if that gets disrupted, and Europe is largely dependent on natural gas to meet their energy requirements, so they will then start importing from other sources. Right now, we are getting quite a bit of our natural gas from, say, Qatar or from Middle East, so that it can happen that some of that might get diverted to Europe, and then there might be a little bit of a problem there. And then when this happens, then there are shifts in fuels. So shifts happen when earlier also we'd seen this, when natural gas became less and less available, there was a little bit of shift to crude, and also then there'll be a little bit shift to coal also.
Okay.
So several countries have gone back to coal. So here also again there would be a little bit of a shift. The other thing which the world has to do is world has to put pressure on the Middle Eastern countries to increase production, which they can do. They have a cushion to increase production. Even marginal increase would have a very good impact on the global price. And consumption cuts, I don't think that's really possible. That could be the other way out, that try to reduce the consumption try to reduce wasteful consumption of various types of fuels, which might again have a very marginal impact. Then reserves, US has been talking of releasing reserves, which they did recently also, and again that talk is there. So a little bit of reserves coming into the market may also have a good impact.
Okay.
These are the only things we can do.
Okay, and Mr. Kapoor, how long do you think this spillover crisis might last? When we're talking about the oil and natural gas sector, as Mr. Joshi was referring to banking and trade, economy, it might be just a short-term impact on certain economies and perhaps a bit longer for certain economies. But vis-a-vis oil and natural gas, how do you perceive the situation from here onwards moving?
So now, even if say this war or this invasion was to end, say in the next 1 week or 10 days, the sanctions, I suppose, wouldn't go away so easily. So, which would mean that the flow of natural gas from Russia to Europe may remain disrupted, or maybe may get reduced, or there might be an impact which may last for a much longer time. So to get alternate supplies, it's going to take a long time. So
Okay.
what I see is that the impact is going to be going to remain for quite some time.
Okay, okay. Mr. Joshi, vis-a-vis the trade and the banking part, in terms of the ways these challenges can be tackled, and not only from the Indian perspective, but from a global perspective as well, what all should be done or can be done in the short run that is more important?
Well, I think as far as mitigation of increased, offsetting the increase in oil prices is concerned, I think Mr. Kapoor was right. I think you'll have to, unless production goes up, I think that risk cannot be mitigated. And I think the oil is now expected to remain high for longer. I mean, that's the current expectation. And so you'll have to live with it. And I think different countries will have to work out different strategies to deal with it. For India, I think the most important channel through which this crisis impacts us is oil, because the higher prices of crude oil, they increase our current account deficit and make us more vulnerable. Our estimate is that the current account deficit as a percentage of GDP goes up by 40 basis points each time the oil price goes up by $10 a barrel. Similarly, it trims GDP growth, so it is a risk to the domestic economy, economic activity, and also I think from an inflation perspective, I think it's a big challenge because it has direct as well as indirect effects. I think so. Now, how do you control it? I mean, from the let me give the domestic perspective on here. I think there are two ways to look. Let's start with inflation. There are two ways to bring it down. One is that central bank starts raising interest rates to tame inflation. But the supply side inflation is better tackled through fiscal measures. I mean, which essentially means that government will if the global crude oil prices don't come down, I think government will have to reduce the excise duties, because that will have a beneficial impact on inflation, and it will also reduce the cost of production for many firms. That is going to push government's fiscal deficit up. I mean, because they'll lose revenues on the excise front. But I think that's probably supply side inflation is better controlled through fiscal measures. So that is one. Second, I think the central bank will have to remain very vigilant on inflation front. Right now, their expectation is of benign inflation playing out in 22-23. The budget math as well as the central bank's projections are based on oil not going up to the levels that we are seeing currently. So I think this has created another risk for both monetary and fiscal management of the economy. So I think that these will have to be, these will have to be fine-tuned, so to say, to the emerging situation. I mean, that we are currently.
Okay, definitely. The short-term and the long-term planning will have to take these factors into account, as well as Mr. Joshi is pointing out. Concluding comments from you, Dhanendra ji, on because if we are looking at the sanctions part, these are likely to, as Mr. Kapoor was pointing out, these are likely to play out for a longer term and perhaps may, result into another economic escalation of tensions between Russia and the Western world as well for a bit more extended period. So what needs to be done by countries like India and others as well, who might end up being, the sufferers due to this vis-a-vis the economic impact we're talking about?
I think India would have very limited elbow room in this regard, because much of it is to be played out in the geopolitical scene. As far as the sanctions is concerned, Western sanctions, particularly banning some Russian banks from SWIFT global financial payment systems, will make it very cumbersome for many companies, many countries to do any kind of business with the country. India can still do something in terms of ruble and rupee trade, but still. And there would be issues of exchange rate. There could also be risk of sanctions if individual Russian commodity players or Russia retaliate by stopping the supply of its products. There would also be effect on supply chains and also on certain businesses because of the rise in the interest rates. Russia has already raised its interest rates almost doubled. So on the question of interest rate sensitive businesses, there would be some impact. So one has to see it from in the granular form. The edible oil, for example, coming from Ukraine, the pipeline, the ports from where it is to flow. In the financial market, one has to see the high frequency indicators like financial markets, exchange rates, crude price in the short term. And India imports about 80% of its crude oil. And as Mr. Joshi rightly said, it has to be calibrated so that the impact of inflation and the spin-off effect in rise in crude prices and petroleum prices is not really fully passed on to the consumers, because all the transport cost would also go up.
Okay.
So at the end of the day, we have to ensure that the consumers are, when we are coming out of the COVID, do not suffer that much. And we have to also calibrate that how best to make sure that our energy needs are met, maybe some from the coal, like aluminum, cement, steel, sponge iron, paper, fertilizer, chemical, and so on. We will also have to meet the demand of our power plants first in order to keep the power requirement going. So altogether, I think we would be concerned in keeping our economy in good shape, inflation under control, and the needs of our consumers, meeting them. So I would feel that the next few weeks and months are going to be crucial. Some of the items coming out of Russia and Ukraine, like as we mentioned, essential metals like palladium, aluminum, nickel, they are used in everything from mobile phones to automobiles. And lithium metals are for the electric vehicles and so on. So I would feel that it has to be a multi-pronged strategy. One has to find alternative sources of supply and also where to get it in the most convenient manner, considering the constraints in the supply lines.
Okay. There it is. You summed it up perfectly well, Mr. Kumar. Multi-pronged strategy would be required. And of course, it is a matter of concern. Thank you so much, Mr. Dhanendra, Mr. Dharmkirti Joshi, and Mr. Tarun Kapoor as well for sharing your views and insight. As our experts were pointing out, of course, the global economic impact would be there vis-a-vis the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict and the way the Western powers and Russia are, face-to-face with each other on the economic aspect. Sanctions on one side and perhaps retaliatory measures from Russia as well. Now, concerns are there and multi-pronged strategy will have to be adopted, but vis-a-vis India and Indian situation, as our experts were pointing out, we might not feel that pinch in the short term, but we should be prepared, and something which the government has already indicated they're working on. An assessment is being done of the entire situation. Steps will be taken. We'll keep you updated with all those news. We'll come back again with a different topic. Till then, keep watching Sansad Television. Thank you.